two audiences, most of in which many of you don't qualify to be in that audience. Okay? The book was written for kids who are seniors in college who are deciding to go get a PhD in economics. Okay? And people who are in their last year of their PhD program deciding that they're going to be professors of economics. And that's who the book is really targeted at, because it's directed at kids that are deciding to go on to get a PhD in economics to try to get them to think about what kind of economist do I want to be. All right? Because when you go to graduate school, you're not really always given that much time to think about that question, because you're learning all the techniques and ideas and whatnot that constitute modern economics. And so you really have to have somewhat of a strong identity when you go to graduate school to decide, okay, this is the kind of economist that I want to be. And then it's also directed at last year graduate students that are going on to become professors to ask them what kind of professor that they want to be. The reality is that all the incentives in higher education are somewhat skewed for people to not be very good professors. You don't really get rewarded for how good a teacher you are. You get rewarded for how well you do research. And in fact, the greatest plum jobs in academics come with zero teaching. Gordon Tullock was one of my teachers. He's a brilliant economist. He was also a teacher of Professor D'Amico here and many of the other people around here. And Tullock, when I was a graduate student, had one student sign up for his class one semester, and that's not allowed, right? You normally need 4 students at least to teach your seminar, but for Gordon Tullock, they would let it slip. And the secretary turned to him and said, "Professor Tullock, you only have 1 student." And he said, "One more than optimal." Tullock was a famous professor, and so the natural incentive for most students that get out of graduate school and start teaching a job is to take whatever they learned as a PhD student and water it down to teach to undergraduate students, because that way they don't have to do any prep time, right? And the problem with that is in a field like economics, that makes economics come across really, really, really boring. And so one of the common difficulties I've had, I always found economics to me changed my life. All right, I did not go to graduate school, or I didn't go to undergraduate school with the thought of being a graduate school student and then a professor. All right, I only read 1 book outside of sports books before I went to college, and that was The Godfather. I will not tell you the reasons why. I explained that earlier. But I read a lot of books about athletes and stuff, but no other knowledge or whatever. I went to college, and the original college that I went there to play basketball. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to be a high school basketball coach, and I was far away from home. It was a school that recruited me to go play basketball there for them, and I got a season-ending injury, and I went through college very, very depressed. And in the spring, my girlfriend back home decided to go to college near me out there, but she wasn't allowed to go to the same school as me, and according to her parents. And I was doing something for the coach on a Saturday, and the coach annoyed me. And I didn't have a car at college, and I went back to the dorm, and I said, "Anyone have let's go down and see where my girlfriend's going to go to college. Maybe I'll go there." And I got in the car and I went down there, and serendipity, we were walking on the campus, and the director of admissions was walking on the campus and says, this is at 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, and he says, "What are you young men doing here?" Because we look scruffy and not very, we shouldn't be there. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I told him my life story or whatever." And the guy says, "Oh, that's funny. I just came from the basketball office. Let me drop you over there." And I went over there, and the basketball coaches at Grove City got me into school, basically. I ended up by going to Grove City, but then I got hurt again. But I had to I wanted to be a high school basketball coach. And the summer before I went to college, I worked digging pools. Well, I worked 2 jobs. Half of the summer I worked digging pools, and then I worked in a factory. Both of these jobs had a huge impact on me in wanting to become an economist. The first thing is that when I was working as digging pools, was in the middle of gas shortages. This is in the late 1970s. Just like you saw on TV a week ago in New Jersey, this is what happened, and we had rationing of gasoline. $5 was the most you could put in. Now keep in mind that gasoline was about 33 cents a gallon, okay? But $5 was the most you could put in the car. And so in the trucks, which are big guzzlers, right? We siphoned gasoline. We'd fill one truck and then we'd siphon the gasoline to do it. Well, I was the youngest kid on the crew. Who do you think got to siphon the gasoline? So, if you think I'm crazy, you can blame it on this. I had to suck on a tube, get the gasoline flowing, which means that it got into my mouth. Then tried to shove it into the gas tank over there and move it there. Every day. Every day. I hated this job. So then what happened was my girlfriend's neighbor saw that I was beat up from this job, and she offered me a job working in an electric factory for what turned out, I'm a huge Yankee fan, and it turned out to be the glorious period of the summer, because it was right when the Yankees, get ready for this, caught up to the Red Sox and ended up by beating the Red Sox after they were out of first place. And that's when Bucky Dent did his famous thing that the Red Sox fans still can't stand. But so I had to quit my job at the thing. So this comes another hard lesson. So I won. I'm pissed off I have to suck on a tube every day. And then what happens is, I'm from New Jersey. The man who ran the pool digging company was Tony. Just like Tony Soprano. And exactly that same, not just the same ethnic group, same, it was a front for the mob, the whole thing was going on, right? So I go there and pick up my pay for the last week that I worked there, because I'm going off to this other job for, and he says, why didn't you all show up for work? I said, remember I told you I'm moving to another job, you owe me money. And he says, like that. And he was in the jacuzzi. I'm not making this up. And just so imagine a guy about 5'5", about 5'5" wide, in a Speedo, bald, with the gold chain with the horn. And he had a silk robe that he put on. And he took me back to the back room, and he got money out of the cash box. And he says, all right. And he paid me. I was making minimum wage. All right? So somewhere around $180 for the week that he goes to pay me. So he hands me the cash. I hold it. Before I can make a step, he goes, and he snatches it from me. And then he says, withholding. And he takes out the amount of money for withholding, puts it in his little pouch of the silk thing, and hands me the money back. Which, okay, so I started with a stack like that, now I have a stack like this, and I'm like, withholding. I shouldn't say that here at Loyola. But I'm from New Jersey, so I just, I was pissed off. So I go off to college, to this new college, and I have 2 things that are annoying me. One, I hate gas lines. Why do I have to have gas lines? This sucks. This should not be the way the world is. No gas lines. And I don't want Tony grabbing my money and saying withhold it. Which, by the way, Tony just becomes another thing for the state, right? Because they're grabbing you and saying, give me your withholding. Why is he taking my money? I worked hard. I had to suck on that too. I earned that money. So I go off to college, still only with the intent of wanting to be a high school basketball coach if I can't make it in basketball at a higher level. And I'm sitting in the back of the room, and I got my baseball cap on and my sweatpants, and probably socks and flip-flops, because that was the wear, at the time. But long-sleeve t-shirts. I always wore long-sleeve t-shirts. And Dr. Semmels, who was my economics professor, says to me, perhaps a student from Slippery Rock State College has slipped into our room. And I'm like, that's interesting. Who's the hell from Slippery Rock that's here? And then he stares me down. This German guy stares me down and he says, at Grove City College, we do not wear ball caps inside. So I take my hat off and I'm like, what would you think right now? Right? You'd think like, okay, I got a jackass for a teacher. Right? So the first day of school, I got a jackass for a teacher. And then he proceeds to explain to me and to the class why it is that we had gas shortages in the United States at the time. It had to do with government policy, just like what had to do with government policy last week, 2 weeks ago. Governor Christie gets on and says, I want everyone to know that if anyone raises the price, you're going to be busted under, anti-gouging laws. So what happened? No one raised price, right? Therefore, no supplies come in, right? If you watch this, go ahead and look it up. There's black markets. You had to wait in line for 6 hours, but you could also pay a black marketeer to get $50 for one of those like red containers full of gas, right? Many people would rather pay $50 than wait in line for 6 hours to get gasoline to fill their tank, right? So Sedholtz explains this. I don't have a blackboard here, but basically he put up a supply and demand curve, and I fell in love. Right? It literally, I sat back there, and it gave me focus of the two things that became very important to me. One is the miracle of how markets operate and how government intervention into the market can distort those markets. And two, who's the source of that intervention, right, is the state, which is also the person taking the money from me in Tony's pocket, right? So I became convinced that anyone, so then I go off to graduate school eventually, after a long little thing like that, and I become an economics professor as a graduate student. And I used to get upset that I didn't have a 100% conversion rate, right? Because I love economics. And my friend, Dave Pacheco, who's a co-author with me on our textbook called The Economic Way of Thinking, Dave said to me at the time, he goes, Pete, don't you know we're the weird ones? And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, not everyone loves economics. I'm like, how could they not love economics? This is the greatest thing in the world. Look at that supply and demand curve. That's the sexiest thing you will ever see. You gotta love economics, right? How can that be? Dave would just shake his head and say, you really are pretty sick. And so ever since that time, I've always been amazed. I go to cocktail parties with my wife, who was my girlfriend back then, right? So now we were childhood sweethearts, and now we've been together 30 years married. I better get the date right, next June. We go to these parties, and either she introduces me or I have to introduce myself, and they say, what do you do for a living? And I say, oh, I'm an economics professor. And inevitably I get, one of three reactions. The first reaction, and the most common one, is that the person acts like I just gave them sour milk. That's the worst class I ever had in college, right? That's because a lot of economics professors are like the caricatures in the movies, right? So, who's one of the most dynamic economics professors in the movies ever? Right? Have you seen this movie, Larry Crown? George Takei? Right? You've seen it, right? That's like a positive portrayal of an economics professor, right? Here's a bad portrayal of an economics professor, right? In the movie Back to School, right? The jerk, right? That's upset, like that. Here's another one in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Right? That's what people think about economists. So the old joke is that God, invented economists because he wanted to make sure accountants looked interesting. Right? So, they look at you like this. So, economics to me is this amazing subject, and yet somehow people don't get sucked into doing economics. To me, once you get exposed to economics, you should all want to be a major. Right? I know Catherine here is a historian. No way! You gotta be an economist, right? You know, someone else here tell me they're a lawyer. Hell with that, economics, right? It's economics 24/7. I know, you know, I'm in a Jesuit school, right? So we have all this things like that. Absolute economics is absolute ethics. Bring it home, right? You know, you want to know why it is that people are poor in Africa, right? It's about economics, right? And so this is how I feel, and not everyone else feels that way. And instead, they feel like, God, this is the most boring subject in the world. So that's the first reaction. I don't really have much to do with that, right? What I do, you know? They think I'm perverse, right? Here's the second reaction. Oh, do you know where interest rates are going? So I become snarky, which is, I always say, if I knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be at this party with you. I'd be in Barbados. Right? Have a grand old time. One of my favorite commercials right now is one with Thomas Sargent, who won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago. And they're asking him about what CD rates are going to be. And they go, Thomas Sargent, one of the smartest men in the world, which he is. And he says, you know, what are the CD rates going to be next year? And he says, I don't know. Right? We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball to tell you about how to invest or anything like that, okay? The third response, which is rare, and it happens only in occasions like this when I'll meet students from Florida State, or I, you know, run into kids from Loyola, or I run into my own graduate students, as they say, oh my God, economics is the greatest thing in the world. I love it. Once I started doing it, I stayed up at night thinking about economics. I want to be an economist. And that's who I think everyone should be. Right? And so, but I rarely run into that person. Most of the time, you know, it's the other three. So this is part of the things that puzzles me about thinking about, you know, what we're doing wrong as economic communicators. The arguments that we have in economics, the argument for free trade, for example, has been more tested and more argued than any other proposition in the social sciences and the policy sciences, and always proven to be right. And yet, we pass legislation constantly for mohair subsidies and, you know, shoes need to do this and protection and all these things like that. All right, if you doubt what I just said about the proposition being tested and proven right, take a look at Doug Irwin's book, all right, called Against the Tide. It's a history of free trade and the debates. He's a professor at Dartmouth. All right, and he goes through all the various different debates and walks you through all of the different ways in which people have tried to counter free trade arguments, what the empirical evidence is, and everything like that. All right, there's not an argument for it in industry, right? It doesn't have any empirical legs, doesn't have any analytical legs. All right, and, you know, and yet we constantly have this thing. Why are we such bad communicators? And that was one of the things that really puzzled me. So the way I'm going to do this is I want to go through and sort of explain the origins and history and the meaning of this. So what I want you to do is take a good look at that title and the cover, and burn it into your memory, because I'm going to keep making reference to the illusions and the titles here. Like in all good things in my life, the title Living Economics wasn't my original title. It was a title that was suggested, but my wife was the one who said, Rosemary said, "Bing, that's the one, that's the title." My titles were your typical boring academic titles. You know, economics for yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That was the title that I had, you know, and everyone's like, yeah, that doesn't work. And, you know, and then I had some other title, you know, I don't know, Economic Truth, 5 names afterwards or something like that. You know, so it didn't work, but they came up with this title. And so I want to try to explain the contents of the books by reference to this the title and to the cover art. So the very first point is that economic science itself is a constantly evolving and living and breathing body of scientific thought. Economics is not a catechism. What economics is an invitation to inquiry. One of the reasons why students get turned off to economics is because we present the material in economics as if it's a conversation stopper. But instead, economics is a conversation beginner. It's the way to get people to think about how the world is organized, and it's amazing intellectual. It taps into the greatest traditions in the history of Western civilization, the greatest thinkers in the history of Western civilization. It's an amazing sort of discipline. This is my favorite economist, Ludwig von Mises. The book actually ends with quotes from Mises. I'll explain that in a little bit. But this is the guiding thing that has driven a large part of my own intellectual efforts as an economist, is this recognition of Mises. I read Mises' great treatise, Human Action, as an invitation to people to study economics in all study man in all walks of life, in a variety of circumstances, all right, in a variety of settings, from the church to the corporate room to the classroom and everything like that. And that economics is this great conversation that's constantly evolving, and that's reflected in the tree by the growing branches. The tree, if you look at the cover, right, has these healthy branches that are growing. None of them are barren. They're all moving out and growing. And it's constantly evolving. As Mises says here, to claim that economics is backward because there's constant debates and discussion among economists is to misunderstand the nature of science. Right? To be a living body of thought, you're constantly evolving and changing, meeting new challenges, going in new directions. Economics didn't stop in 1776. It didn't stop in the 1820s. It certainly didn't stop in 1920 or 1940. It's constantly evolving, and when we talk to our students, we have to get them to be excited about where they can take economic arguments, where they can evolve as thinkers and bring those to the problems that we face today. Ludwig von Mises is the greatest economic mind, in my estimation, but he didn't even know what the internet was. Right? How can he talk about the world that we live in today, right, in some sense, in terms of the application of economic reasoning? You have to do that. Right? Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, here comes the second part, which is, go again, look at that tree. That tree is deeply rooted in the ground. If a tree is not deeply rooted in the ground, right, it topples over. The science of economics is deeply rooted, and those roots find themselves in the Scottish Enlightenment, in the thinking of David Hume and Adam Smith. And they go forward with the French liberal school of Boettke and Jean-Baptiste Dessay. And they continue further with the British utilitarians, John Stuart Mill. All right? And then they evolve eventually into the Austrian school of economics, which is the Austrian marginalist and Austrian subjectivist, which goes from Menger to Mises to Hayek, and then develops further with public choice economics, new institutional economics, property rights economics, experimental economics. Economics is constant, but it's the men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith. This is Lord Acton. All right? How many have heard of Lord Acton? Come on, power. How many have heard the phrase, power tends to corrupt absolute, power tends to corrupt absolutely? All right, that's Lord Acton. Okay? This is a letter that Lord Acton is writing to Lady Gladstone, who's asking him about contemporary politics. Meaning, like, the most recent thing that we just went through. Imagine, someone writing about the Ryan-Biden debate to you, or the Obama-Romney debate, the third debate. What do you think? Where's this going? All these things like that. And what Acton writes back is he says, it's not these men of the moment. It's not the popular politics of the day that you should be paying attention to. It's the men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith that are worthy of our attention. It's understanding the systemic principles that understand a society of free and responsible individuals that we should be exploring and examining. And that's what Acton is trying to emphasize here. All right? So, that tree and those branches are healthy based on the idea that they're grounded and rooted in the ideas of Adam Smith. And then they branch out and they go in these various different directions, and they're healthy to the extent that they're built into that foundation. So it's not that economics is constantly made anew every day. Right? that you have to rethink the foundations. What you have to do is rethink the branches in which you're going out in. And here's the final one. This goes back to my own experience. Once you get really seduced by the logic of economics, and you really understand it, it is really hard to think about anything else. It's the way that you view everything in the world. These questions are not questions just of like trivial matter. They're the questions about fundamental life and death. All right, here's a homework assignment for all of you, especially those of you who are in Leo's class. Okay? Because you're taking stats. I want you to write this down. It's a YouTube video. It's called 200 Countries Over 200 Years in 4 Minutes. It was a video that was produced by BBC in a thing called The Joy of Stats. Okay? It's by a man named Hans Riesling. And what he shows is that over the last 200 years, everyone began in very poor and sick. All of us were poor and sick. So on this axis, we're going to plot per capita income. On this axis, we're going to plot life expectancy. Okay? So if you some of the countries over 40,000. And what he does in this video is he shows that you start out here, all the countries here. Obviously, by the way, Great Britain is up top at the 200 years ago. Right? And then what happens is you get countries like this. This is the Industrial Revolution. And then they go like this, and then you go like this. So you get what's called in economics a hockey stick. Most of human history is like this. Deirdre McCloskey, who was a very dynamic economist, she does this. She says, okay, everyone get ready. Here's the tricky thing. She goes, here's human history. And she walks across the stage. And then she stops. She says, here's the tricky part. Right? And that's been the mystery that economists have been trying to understand. That's called the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith's book is called The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Why? Adam Smith is trying to explain that tick up, right? Hans Riesling is explaining this, right? Here we go, like this. What's the tragedy? Some countries are still here, right? They're still down in the barely, out of the sick and poor, right? That's underdevelopment problem. Then you have other countries up here, okay? So what we want to understand is, what generated that idea, and then once you start thinking about that and realize what that means. We don't eat growth rates, but you do experience female ability to have access to education. If you're poor and sick, you won't have access to education. If you're healthy and wealthy, yep. Here's a bigger mystery for you. If you're from Afghanistan, in 1960, it was better for you to be a woman in Afghanistan in 1960 than a woman to be in Afghanistan in 1990. That's weird. Why would that be the case? Okay? Those are the kind of questions. And you can't go to sleep. Some of you are sleeping already. But, if you get really into this, you can't go to sleep thinking about this. This is Bob Lucas. And this is what he's in this essay called The Mechanics of Economic Development. And it says in this thing, once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. Because these questions are the most important questions on the most important policy questions that you face in the world. So, economics is evolving, economics is deeply rooted, economics is vitally important. So why is it that people have such a difficult time thinking about economics? That's what I'm trying to do. So the book is divided into basically 3 parts. First part is, what are the core principles of economics? How should we teach the introduction to economics? So I mentioned before that I'm the co-author on a principles book called The Economic Way of Thinking. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. I took over that book from a man named Paul Hayne. Paul Hayne is the author of that book, and he was the author of that book for many, many iterations of the book. And then unfortunately he got ill, and as he was sick, he asked me if I would keep the book alive as an economics book. And he had known that I had taught from the book for many years, and so we did that. But the reason why Hayne's book is so attractive and why I got involved in the project is because one of Paul Hayne's main lessons is teach economics to your principal students as if it is the last class they will ever take in economics, and it will be the first of many. All right? So what you don't do in economics is try to teach them and then say, oh, I got to prepare them to get a PhD from MIT in economics. All right, I have an example in the first part of the book of a professor at Johns Hopkins who prided himself. Johns Hopkins is a very good school. Everyone know that here? Okay, right? It's a very good school. And in his freshman, he was all excited because the average score on the final was a 52. And he thought, makes me tough. Right? This is one of the problems with economists. Economics, right? It used to be called political economy. Right? When you were in political economy, that meant you hung out with the people that end with Y's. So I hang out with philosophy, sociology, history. Those are my buds. Right? Now, who's the X crowd? Mathematics, physics, mechanics. So in the battle for social sciences, when universities started to have departments, who do I want to hang out with? All of you will know this. Do I want to hang out with the engineering professors? I'm just talking about sheer money here. Do I want to be in an engineering department or in the English literature department? Come on, you all know, right? English literature, what's their opportunity cost? Driving a cab, right? The engineer, right? What can they do, right? So what's going to happen? I'm going to go into engineering. So if I'm trying to have a battle for, right? If I'm going to try to have a battle for where I would put my department, I'm not going to put it in the arts, I'm going to put it in the sciences. And so economics had a very, very strong incentive when they were forming their department to no longer be called departments of political economy or parts of, actually what they were called before was departments of moral philosophy. They're a branch of moral philosophy. That's what Adam Smith was. He was a professor of moral philosophy. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a professor of economics. I'm over there. I get paid the higher wages. I can scoff at all the arts, right? And so that's sort of what happened over here. And so when they start teaching this, the professor, this is Alfred Marshall, is the person who solidified the discipline of economics at Oxford and moved it out of philosophy department and into its own department, okay? And that happens around 1890, and it becomes a very, very big thing. And then that translates over in the United States. So what this professor was saying is, I'm tough. You can't get through. This is principles of economics. So here's the hypothesis that you have to entertain. One, students at Johns Hopkins, who all score around 1,400 on their SATs, can't understand basic supply and demand economics. That's one hypothesis. It doesn't seem very plausible. Two, the professor can't teach. That's one hypothesis. Professor doesn't know how to write an exam. There's another hypothesis. Clearly, hypothesis 2 and 3 are more plausible than hypothesis 1. But yet, that's what we pride ourselves on all along. That's not how you teach economics as if it was the last class your students will ever have, and it will be the first of many classes they'll want to take. All right? That's the goal of a good economics professor. The other thing I emphasize in here is that a lot of time in economics classes, because we're not teaching it like it's the first of many the last class someone will ever have, we tend to focus on these nuanced points which tend to lose people, and then we end up by the student only remembers what the exceptions are and not the general principles. So we fail in our target. So what we need to know is what's enduring and what's fleeting in the history of the discipline of economics and the science. The second part, there are great examples of teachers that teach the principles of economics. They populate schools across, Europe and the United States. They've been fantastic teachers, and I try to select out a bunch of various different teachers and give examples of the way in which they tried, through their work and through their teachings, to communicate the core principles of economics. And so we give you a sort of a tour of all these various different people as we walk through that, including many of my own teachers that I was fortunate enough to be exposed to. And then the third part is, how would this change the way we do economics? So here's one of the puzzles in the book, is that since 1950, we have been asking economics to do something which it is constitutionally, I don't mean that legally, I mean by the essence of it, constitutionally unable to do, which is to provide information about something like, remember what I said about the question to Tom Sargent? We expect an economist like that to be able to say, CD rates will be yielding X amount in 5 years from now. It's called forecasting. Okay? Now, I don't tell this story in the book, but it's a great story about forecasting. Otto Eckstein was one of the really people who engineered the idea of economic forecasting, ran a thing called Data Resource Management, I think, it was the title of his company. He was an economics professor, and during the 1960s, how many here, by the way, just let me put things in perspective about this date that I picked. How many here know that, let's say, prior to 1913, we didn't have a Federal Reserve System? Okay, so you know that. How about prior to, after World War II, we didn't have a Bretton Woods Agreement, for example, right? That came in 1946. We didn't have a Council of Economic Advisors. Lincoln did not have a Council of Economic Advisors, right? Okay, so Council of Economic Advisors is a product. We passed a law called the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, which demanded that the economic policies generate full employment. Okay, the older people here, does everyone remember that? That was a law that was passed. The government decrees it, that it's a law that you have to have 100%, full employment. Can't have any of this shady stuff. That's a law. Okay? All right, so that didn't work out too well. But we had this Council of Economic Advisors, and Kennedy was one of the first ones that really had a big sort of economic team, and then Johnson inherited it. And Johnson used to have economists come in all the time and talk. And Johnson used to get bored. Remember? Right, like I said before, I'm bored about economics because, we're making accountants seem interesting, And so these economists would come in, and Johnson would always say, after 5 minutes, the story goes, his eyes would glaze over, and he'd say, "Professor, if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich?" Right, and that would end the conversation, there we go. So then, he has Otto Eckstein coming in. Okay? And Johnson's sitting there, and his aides say, "Oh, Mr. President, you cannot say to Professor Eckstein your standard line because he's really, really rich." And so Johnson says, "Okay." But 5 minutes into the talk, Johnson's eyes glaze over, he gets bored, he says, "Professor, I understand you're a very wealthy man." And Eckstein says, "Well, yes, Mr. President, I've been very fortunate. I've done quite well for myself." He says, "Well, tell me, if you're so rich, how come you're so stupid?" Right? So Hayek pointed out that economists have this weird position in which we're called upon more than any other social science to offer advice on pressing matters of public policy, to only have our advice dismissed as soon as it's uttered. Okay? Think about like the fiscal cliff right now and the discussions about that. All right? I will tell you this. My expectations are, and I'm not a great predictor, so don't bet the farm on this, okay? But my view is that they're not going to face the fiscal cliff because they're going to kick the grenade down the road, right? Because what's everyone saying in Washington right now? Right? They're having a kumbaya moment. We got to get together. We got to do this, right? Because that's what legislation is about. We can do this, right? And they never ask the question, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. All right? And And just like on the opposite job, just because you should do something doesn't mean you can do it. Right? And there's a constraint, a real constraint on sometimes. We want to eliminate this, but we might not have the abilities to do it. So think about that as you go through these things. There's both the just because you can doesn't mean that you should, and just because you should doesn't mean that you can. All right? Think through those various different bubbles there. So economists are in this kind of very strange position. So what actually would be the kind of position that I would hold if the economics teaching? One of massive humility. What economists are at best social critics. They engage in criticism of existing proposals. So you tell me, you're the Gator man here, right? So he's like the President of the United States, and he says, I want to help the least advantaged in society. That's his goal. And then he proposes a bunch of policies to me. And what I can do as an economist is I don't dispute with him his goal. What I do is examine the effectiveness of his chosen means to his ends that he tries to get at. That's the most important role that economists has. Here's the problem with that. What economists do is they put parameters on people's utopias. Right? He says, oh, I want to go to the Olympics. And I said, that's cool, you want to go to the Olympics? And he says, yeah, and here's the means. I'm going to eat chocolate cake every day. And I say, you know what? Chocolate might not be, screw you, I like chocolate. Right? That's what's going on, right, with this, right? Is that you have means that are insufficient to obtain the end sought after, and the economist is the one telling you you can't do that. And so what's your reaction? I don't like what you're telling me. Okay? So I'm going to have economic growth. Right now in our policies, I'll talk about this in a second, but our policies have constantly traded off long-run economic growth in order to have short-run economic relief. Well, what you can't do is have the relief and have the growth. Right? You can't bail out inefficient farms and not cause perverse incentives which distort long-term economic growth. All right? And that's where the difficulty comes in. Economists, by the way, don't have a problem with, say, recognizing that people have different endowments and that there may, in fact, be tremendous injustice in those endowments. Right? You're randomly given this certain, advantages in life and other people that. Here's the question that economists always ask. I can level endowments, but can I level those endowments without distorting incentives? If I end up by distorting the incentives, I'm going to end up by not fixing the endowment problem. And so we always have to examine those kind of questions. Okay? So Hayek sums up the position of the economist by saying the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. All right? If you think about it this way, I have a diagram in the book which has a 2x2 matrix. And it has the position of the government on one side, right, on the top. And then on the side, I have the role of the economist. And what I divide the state into, or the government into, is the state as a referee. So it's my understanding, by the way, that at Loyola, you have a lot of students from Latin America. Is that still true that come here? So you guys oftentimes don't like real sports. You like soccer. And I noticed one thing about soccer fans. They get really worked up into a frenzy. Right? Like, I love basketball. I still love basketball. I want to spend the winter in Italy watching basketball because it's the only place on earth that they sing in the middle of a basketball game, right? And I want to go to the games, they're doing all this stuff. So I watch European basketball like crazy, right? And I watch the soccer games, and like you beat each other, you do all these things like that. What's the worst thing that could happen in a soccer game? If the referee causes your team to lose, right? The referee interferes in a game. What do you love about a soccer game? Well, okay, your team wins, but one of the things that you would love to see is that you wouldn't even notice the referee in the game, but yet they govern the game. Okay? That's the government as a referee. We shouldn't even see it. Right? Ever. The other thing is the government is an active player in the economic game. The government is seen as a corrective to all social ills. All right? Now, I can either see the state as a referee or the state as an active player. Now, if I'm an economist, I'm going to divide the economist into the economist as a student of society and the economist as a savior. Keynes, in the second volume of his biography on Keynes, is called The Economist as Savior because Keynes claimed that for himself. Right? That's, in fact, the direct word. We are the savior. Right? So, the economist as savior. Economist as student, economist as savior. Now, here's something interesting. When Adam Smith was writing, the state was seen as a referee, not as an active player. And economists that claimed that they were saviors, they were subject to ridicule. Adam Smith refers to them as men of systems, who believe that they can move people around as if they are pieces on a chessboard. And that was the common wisdom of economics. In Adam Smith's famous chapter on the invisible hand, the discussion of the invisible hand, he gives a point. He says, look, not only does the government not have the ability to guess how men should use their own capital, but we would nowhere trust that in a man who had the presumption and folly to imagine himself fit to tell you how to run your own life. He's making fun. It's like a joke. Just Scottish Enlightenment version. Okay? Of these kind of things. By the time we get to Keynes, if you hold the Smithian position, you're viewed as a fatalist. Someone who's not taking the decisive action that needs to be taken at this moment in time. And instead, the economist is viewed as the person that must do what? Control aggregate demand. Right? Decide how to use the budget to be able to fix the economy, not worry about balancing the budget, and so forth and so on. And so, what I want to say to you is that if you imagine that 2x2 matrix, there's only two equilibria. The state as a referee, the economist as a student, which is a very humble view. That's where economics really is a branch of philosophy. Or the economist as, the state as an active player, and the economist as a savior, in which case economics needs to be like social engineering. All right. Why did I write this book? Has anyone ever here been to Guatemala? Just a few people here, okay? So the University of Guatemala that 2 years ago contracted me to go down there and oversee their curriculum and examine and give ideas. I went down there with a colleague of mine, Chris Coyne, close colleague of mine, and we went down there. It's called University of Francisco Marroquín. University of Francisco Marroquín is a very fascinating university because it was founded by a man named Manuel Ayau, who was educated here in North America in mechanical engineering. And he went back down to his home in Guatemala, wanting to look for a job as a mechanical engineer. And he found out that he couldn't find any work as a mechanical engineer because they weren't building. And he started asking himself questions. Why is it that they're not building here? And as a result, he became a very successful businessman, but not as a mechanical engineer. And he started asking himself these questions. Why is there not economic opportunities? When I was in Canada or in the United States, there's all these economic opportunities. Why aren't there opportunities here in Guatemala? And so in order to answer that question, he founded a think tank which studied economics and mainly the division of labor. What allows for the division of labor, the expansion of productive capacity of mankind, what thwarts the division of labor. And then from that, he decided to found a university. And in that university, it's like a dream come true to people like me. Because every student has to take economics. It has a medical school, you got to take a year of economics. You got dentistry, year of economics. Architecture, year of economics. Political science, year of economics. You cannot, he had everyone in their curriculum study economics. So it's this amazing place. And all the architecture of the place is to highlight economic ideas. Alright? And so we went down there and we started doing it, and during the process of being down there and examining their curriculum, the idea came up that a book like what I'm trying to do would actually fit their purpose. And that's actually how the book kind of came about. And in that, I make a distinction between mainline economics and mainstream economics. Because you hear a lot of people say things like, oh, your positions you hold are not mainstream. I have taught at New York University, which is a top 10 department in economics. I have taught at the London School of Economics, which is a top university in economics in Europe. I spent a year at Stanford, which is a great university for economics. I've never once felt out of step as an economist. I have felt that people didn't agree with me. And we had to have intellectual disagreements. Remember the branches of the trees? That's the nature of science. I have felt at times that I wasn't up to the challenge. People that are on the other side might be smarter. And they might have actually, you know, beat me out in the debate. And then what that means is I go home and I study more. But I never once felt like I was kicked out. One of my favorite scenes is in the movie Splash. The movie Splash, right, this is where Tom Hanks, it's a young Tom Hanks, and Daryl Hannah, young Daryl Hannah, she's a mermaid. And there's a scientist named Bloombot. And he's been chasing around his whole life looking for a mermaid. Because he saw her when she was a young kid, right? And so he's looking for the mermaid. And he finally finds her. And they capture her. And then the main scientists, let's say MIT scientists, are studying the mermaid. And this guy complains that they're treating her unethically. Because they're testing her and all these things like that. And he says to him, he says, listen, I never considered you part of my community. Why don't you now go and run and find a unicorn? That would be someone kicking you out of the scientific community and dismissing you, your view. I have never felt that. And so when kids, especially young kids, come to me and they say, oh, I never heard of these ideas. Well, that's kind of weird, because the people that I'm talking about all won the Nobel Prize in economics. So, like, who's been teaching you economics? Like Chucklehead McGee? Right? So, you know, what's going on here? Like, maybe you got a bad education in economics. Right? Oh, I never heard of, you know, F.A.I.S. or I never heard of Ludwig Mises. Really? Well, if you read, like, John Kenneth Galbraith, he goes out of his way to attack Mises. In the most popular book in the 1960s, The Affluent Society. Who's his targets? Hayek, Mises. Being a target of somebody doesn't mean that you're out of... You know what it means to be out of the mainstream? They don't pay attention to you at all. Like, who's that? I never heard of that person. Right? Not when they sit there. Mises' Human Action comes out. It's reviewed in the New York Times. I would kill someone to have my book reviewed in the New York Times. Right? If I had a choice right there, well, you're dead. I want my book reviewed in the New York Times, right? You know, these guys, Mises won Distinguished Fellow for the American Economic Association. You don't win that award unless you're a major thinker in your field. It's not like any, you know, Tom, Dick, or Harry like says, hey, make me Distinguished Fellow, right? I'll give you lots of money. No, that's not allowed to happen. Right? It's because Mises won the top award in the country of Austria for the top scientist. Right? This is a major thinker. Meet Hayek wins a Nobel Prize. These people are big deals. My professor, James Buchanan, Nobel Prize. Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize. Why are these people weird? They're not weird. They won the Nobel Prize. All right? So where are you saying that these ideas? So it then dawned on me, well, people must mean something else. They must mean something else by these terms. So, if we go back to my tree, there's a main line of economics that runs from Adam Smith and David Hume to John Baptiste Say and Frederick Bastiat to John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, okay, into Menger, Mises, Hayek, Armin Alchian, right, Israel Kirzner, right? All these other people, Vernon Smith, James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, it's a whole tradition of that. They all belong as the men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith. And then there's mainstream, which is, you must mean by that, not substantive propositions about how you understand economics, but who's like cool. Right? Remember high school? Like, who's cool? Right? So that's like the mainstream. So what does it mean to be cool? It means you can teach at Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, MIT, or Stanford. In economics, it's not really cool to teach at Yale. Right? Like you're a wannabe if you're at Yale. But if you're at Princeton, you have it made. Right? You're part of the big crowd. And so what we have is we have a difference between the mainstream, which is a sociological construct, and a mainline, which is a substantive proposition. All right? And that sort of dawned on me and became a major theme in the way in which I approach this stuff. So this is UFM, and this is, UFM believes, it's by the way, remember what I said, expounded by a businessman. What's the difference between businessmen and academics? Businessmen sweat the details. Academics paint in broad brushes. So everything about this university is detail-oriented to make sure the students are constantly inundated with the ideas and messages that the administration wants to get from them. Everywhere they turn, there's images. The new Socratic seminar room is called the Carl Menger Room in the Michael Polanyi College. Everything is named, brand new building that they just put up right there. Okay? So everything about this is the signal. So this is not going to do this justice, what I'm going to do next. Because, so the business school is here and the economics department is over there by, say, where Professor D'Amico is. And I had to walk across a bridge. So you walk across a bridge from the business school, because we advise across all the different disciplines. And then once I get across the bridge, I'm confronted with a mural. And the mural wraps around, it goes like this and then stops. And then there's a second wall, let's say that Professor D'Amico's over there. And then there's another wall there. And then there's going to be, at the end of that, a major quote that they hold about the importance of economics. And we saw this every day we were there. This is distorted because I can't get it to be big enough and yet reflect it. It's a 20 by 20 foot mural, okay? 20 by 20, it's huge. And it starts with Richard Cantillon, who wrote the first, many people attribute the first systemic treatise in economics, okay? And then it carries through on the first one all the way up through the, as I said, the classical economists, the French liberals, the British utilitarians, the Austrian marginalists, and then you have, you know, the modern Austrian school, let's say, represented by Ludwig von Mises. And then the next wall, which comes us closer to the modern age, you know, has Henry Hazlitt and Hayek, Friedman, Doug Nord, Ronald Coase, Murray Rothbard, Gary Becker, Vernon Smith, Israel Kirzner. Okay? So, and then there's the modern generation after that, which is not yet up on the wall. So the question became, to me, who's on the wall and who's not on the wall? And what was the criteria by which you put them on the wall and you didn't put them on the wall? And I pondered this. So Dan asked me a question. He said, I said to all of you, all the students that I went before, I said, you want to know what you should study? What keeps you up late at night? What wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you ponder like, okay, why is this the case? Okay? Part of my job as an economics instructor is to get you to be excited about the mystery of the mundane. All right? My background was in studying socialist economies. And in the 1980s, you're going to have a new movie coming out, Red Dawn Part 2, okay, which is with the Chinese. It's terrible. But the first one was really bad too, with Patrick Swayze. But it was about the Russians, okay, Russians and the Cubans. But you got to put yourself in that mindset, or watch Rambo from that period, right? He takes out a Soviet MiG with an arrow, right? Or Rocky, right? You know, Rocky with Dragos or whatever, you know, You be hating me and I be hating you, you know. Right? So we were all hyped. Listen to Sting. Russians are people too. That was a song, right? The belief was the world was going to, you know, constantly blow up any minute. So Ted Turner decided that one of his things that he would do is he would try to communicate to Americans the beauty of Russia, and that Russians are in fact just like us. And so we had a train that ran from Moscow to Vladivostok. And he did interviews with different people, so that we'd be exposed to the average Russians, and therefore we wouldn't hate them, and therefore we wouldn't want to send a bomb to kill them. Right? That was the idea. So they had an interview with a professor from Columbia who was visiting at Moscow State University, MGU, and she's there, and they say to her, what's the difference between living in Moscow versus living in New York City? And at first, she's like, nothing. That's right. And then she stops. Totally unedited, unscripted, everything. She just stops. And she says, well, there is one big difference. When I'm back at Columbia, if I want to go to get a cucumber in January, all I need to do is go to the Grand Union and a cucumber's there. But if I'm here in Moscow in August, and there's reports that there's a bumper crop, but I can't get cucumbers, that bothers me. And then they just moved on quickly. To me, I'm like, ding, 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 ding. That's the puzzle of economics. Where are the cucumbers coming from? Right? How do I explain that? You know, and I go, you know, I'm at the cocktail party with my wife, and I'm like, the cucumbers. And everyone's like, shut up. So, it's the mystery of the mundane. Right now, there's a YouTube video up that tries to capture the iPencil story. So I recommend that you go look at that. Okay? Milton Friedman on the cover of Free to Choose holds up a number 2 pencil. He gets a story from a man named Leonard Reed, who wrote The Family Tree of the iPencil. Adam Smith, by the way, in The Wealth of Nations, did it for a common woolen coat on the back of a day laborer. And what they show is the number of exchanges far exceed the ability of any one of us to be able to understand and organize those exchanges. We instead marshal the self-interest of all of these individuals throughout the world to be able to produce the number 2 pencil, right, that you hold. So I recommend that you look at this video because that's such a simple product, but yet think about all the people that are embedded through the division of labor in producing just that simple product. Now think about things like your shoes, your pants, the sweater that you're wearing, the glasses that you're wearing. Right? This is the mystery of the mundane. If you get excited about that, right, then you're starting to learn what economics is about. And understand that. That's called the invisible hand. How it is that individuals, in pursuing their self-interest, will generate a publicly desirable outcome. Right? That's why we have the mystery of economics. Right? And so how is it the people that end up on this wall, those are the ones who understand the invisible hand. The ones who don't end up on the wall, Karl Marx, Thomas Malthus, John Maynard Keynes, Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz. All significant figures, but what didn't they get? They don't understand the invisible hand. It's not an ideological position. It's an analytical issue. How is it that you can possibly imagine how individuals pursuing their self-interest will generate a publicly desirable outcome? And explicating that mechanism. That's what economists do. They explain those cucumbers. They can explain the absence of those cucumbers. By the way, it's not really tricky. It's called incentives. All right? So, if you walk away from here with anything tonight, understand something. How it is that individuals pursuing their self-interest gets translated into a publicly desirable outcome is through an institutional framework of property, prices, and profit and loss. Property gives us incentives, prices give us information, profit and loss gives us innovation. Go back to Hans Riesling's video. The countries that are poor and sick, they lack secure property rights, they have administered pricing, they don't have accurate profit and loss accounting. They are dealing with distorted incentives, perverse incentives, distorted information, and inaccurate profit and loss accounting. Okay? Here's another thing. If I privatize profits and socialize losses, don't be surprised when things go haywire. By the way, welcome to the modern financial market in the United States. Okay, that's why you had a crisis in 2008. Not because of greed. Greed's like air. It's always there. Why did it get distorted in this particular way? Okay? It got distorted in that particular way because you set up a system where people privatize their profits, socialize their losses. So you look a smart guy, let's go to Vegas. You and I go to Vegas. And I say to you, hey, you know what? You make any losses at the roulette wheel, I'll pay for you. But you get to keep all the profits that you're going to do. What kind of bet you going to do? Yeah, on 17, you going to hold it or are you going to like say, put it down? Yeah, right? Welcome to AIG. Okay? That's what's going on there, okay? So we have to change that system, otherwise we're going to distort this. So who qualifies and who doesn't? Okay, let me finish up here. So all of this stuff matters for the things that we talk about today. So Adam Smith still is relevant for our conversations today because the way Adam Smith analyzed questions, we still can rely on to answer questions for us today. Remember that tree? Adam Smith in the 5th book of The Wealth of Nations, remember the title of the book? An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In the 5th part of that book, it's advice to a potential statesman, basically telling him to play this humble role rather than an activist role, which is what mercantilism was. And he's comparing and contrasting. What Adam Smith argues is that, look, here's the problem. Let's get right down to it. Governments, ancient as well as modern, like to engage in a juggling trick. And here's the juggling trick. They want to spend money because they want to do things now. Adam Smith actually points out about 10 pages prior to this passage that the reason why they do this is because they want to engage in military adventurism. Because that's enjoyment for them. Watch them battle down there and I'm up on the hill and isn't that neat? Kind of like going to a football game. Alright, except that bad things are going on. So that costs money to do that. So do I want to pay for that? Right? So how am I going to pay for it? I'm going to run a deficit. That deficit becomes part of an accumulating public debt. That public debt then represents an obligation. So what am I going to do? I'm going to debase my currency to pay the debt back, right, with cheaper money. So, since I killed you before, let me bring you up, right? So, imagine that you're going to go Christmas shopping for your family and friends. And what I do is I give you a counterfeit machine in the bottom of your basement that's perfect. You'll never get caught. I tell you, you're not going to get caught, and you can believe me, right? You're never going to get caught. It's perfect. Looks just like dollars. What is your effective budget constraint when you go out there to buy presents for your family? No, right? You're giving your sisters a Mercedes-Benz. Here you go, sweetie. I love you so much. Here's your Mercedes-Benz, right? Like this. A gentleman recently, Jerry Jordan, who used to be one of the governors of the Fed, I was talking, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, you know what the problem is with our arithmetic in our country today? It's like as if I went to my executor and I'm going to die, right? And what my executor gets is this order after I die, which was, I have 3 daughters. Each of my daughters gets 1/2 of my estate. Among my 6 grandchildren, we divide what's left over equally. Okay? Note who the problem is. Not my promise, the executor. Right? This is the issue of passing these things down the road. Okay? So Adam Smith warned us about this because what we're doing is we're engaging in an endless cycle of deficits, debt, and debasement. And we have unleashed this since 1950. For the first 150 years in the United States, look this up, we basically ruled under a balanced budget rule, which said that any time that you ran deficits, you tried to eliminate those deficits in the next round as fast as possible. So you would run budget deficits during times of crisis, war, things like that. But then in the next round, you would try to offset them. So we basically ruled under what was called a budgetary balance norm. Since 1950, we adopted a philosophy called functional finance, which says that you use the budget to balance the economy, you never worry about balancing the budget. And after that became our norm, we have balanced the budget only very few times. Okay? Increasingly out of budget. All right? During that time, increasing numbers coming out of that. Okay? So let's take a look. I won't go into all the other debates here. I just want to end with this one. But let's take a look at like our current public policy with regard to meeting the crisis. So again, property prices and profit and loss. If you want some background on this, read Democracy and Deficit by Jim Buchanan and Richard Wagner, and read F.A. Hayek's little essay book monograph called Tiger by the Tail. It's about the relationship between deficits and inflation. Okay? So that's a good way to frame the debate of what's going on. Well, what has Boettke engaged in? Boettke, by the way, is like the sweetest guy in the world to get this job. He's very, very well trained as an economist, was a monetary historian of the Great Depression. His reason why he's engaged in the activities he's engaged in is precisely connected to his academic work on why the Great Depression took place. So you can trace it back and you see a logic behind that position. But what he's engaged in is a thing called quantitative easing. Okay? And when you engage in quantitative easing, what you do is you're monetizing, okay? And the expectations are going to be that long-run interest rates should be going up. Okay? Everyone with me? If you're a bank and you expect you're going to loan money to him. Now, the original rate right now is 4%, and you're going to lend money to him. But you expect that he's going to pay you back that loan in 10 years from now. But in between, we're going to have 10% inflation. Right? You don't want to just get 4%, because then you just lost money. Everyone with me? So what's going to happen is you're going to creep that interest rate up, because 10 years from now, you're going to want him to pay you the interest rate that you're charging plus the inflation rate to be able to get your money, 14%, right? So that's a hedge. At 4%, would you borrow the money? At 14%, would you borrow the money? You might not. You want to lend money. So if he's not going to do it because your rates are going up, right? He's not going to engage in activity. That sort of stalls the economy. That's market actors hedging, right? You, on the one hand, raise the interest rate. He reacts to that by making money now more, difficult for him to obtain. Well, Boettke wants to stimulate the economy, so he doesn't want that going on, right? So what did he do? Besides also engaging in QE3, they engage in what's called Operation Twist, which is he's lending you the money, and I'm buying up all those long-term treasuries to keep the interest rates down. So I'm going to keep long-term rates down and short-term rates down. All right? This is a monetary policy that's going on at the moment. All right? That's going to have to be adjusted. So Smith argued, let's go back now to Adam Smith, he said, look, governments are going to engage in this endless act of deficit, debt, and debasement juggling tricks. So just think about that. Here I am, I'm juggling. Right? This is what's bad. How do I stop me from juggling? Well, one, take the balls away from me. Or the juggling sticks. Two, tie my hands behind my back. Three, chop my arms off. Right? That's really the only way. Right? By the way, I could be even a skilled juggler behind my back. Right? So chopping the arms off might actually be good. So now, it turns out, by the way, that if you study the history of modern thinkers in economics, what they've done is they've gone through various different things. Think about Milton Friedman. What's a monetary rule? That's trying to tie their hands behind the back. What's Hayek's denationalization of money? That's cutting off the arms. Right? But the point that Adam Smith is doing is saying, look, you need to stop the juggling. The juggling is what destroys nations, according to the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. You let endless juggling take place, nations fall. So why do nations fail? It's because they do things like QE2 and QE3 and Operation Twist in mass. All right, and that's when money dies, system enters into this crisis and things like that. I'm not saying we're going there. Right? Understand that. Right? There's puzzles that we still have. Like, why is it that we don't see foreign investment leaving the United States rather than staying in? It must mean that the United States is a better investment opportunity than other countries at the moment. Okay? Which might tell you really bad things are going on in other countries as well, right? But these are the kind of questions that we have to do. Alright, so that's enough of that. We can answer other questions. So let me just finish with 2 slides here that will take me a very short period of time. So here's what I want to end with, the message. Economics is the greatest thing that could ever happen to your life. Fall in love with economics. It is the it science. It's very cool. All right? And the reason why it's cool is that it explains human action across all walks of life. Okay? It's the science of human action. It's not just about prices and money. All right? It's about human decision-making in all walks of life. It's also the most important subject. It's about the wealth and poverty of nations. You can't answer an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of nations without investing a lot of time in understanding economics. You just will simply not have an answer to that question. You can't have an answer to the empirical reality that Hans Riesling is giving you. That there were countries that were poor and sick, and now they're healthy and wealthy. Why? He doesn't ask that question. He asks a what question. Most historians, for example, ask what questions. What happened? Right? Economists are the mechanism about why things happen. Why what happened happened. That's an economics answer. Okay? That's why we need economics. Alright, so there's been a meme which Loyola should jump into. But you guys, I don't know, that's up to you to do. Dan's not pushing this, so he's failing on the meme front. But a former Loyola graduate is responsible for this picture, Nick Snow. And this is the idea of the main line of economics and how it's emerging. And I always use this, but I can use lots of different examples. All right, Professor Stringham here. It has a new book coming out with Oxford, which is on the history of private policing and private ordering mechanisms. Professor D'Amico works on, prison systems and punishment systems. Professor Snow over here is another Loyola graduate. 2 Loyola graduates here, 1 Holy Cross graduate. They're all blockheads. The Snow here is working on economics of prohibition. So I could use many different examples of people who are doing economics as entertaining. Right? Nick has a paper on rum runners. He also has a paper on hooligans. You remember the soccer guys? All right, so the hooligans, right? He asks these interesting questions, all right, about these things. These are 2 of the books that I use. These are 2 of my colleagues that I work with at George Mason every day. One of them is Peter Leeson, and I highly recommend reading this book. It's called The Invisible Hook. The Secret Economics of Pirates. And it's about how the pirates organize their thing based on economic principles. It's an amazingly fun read. Right? Princeton just released a version of it which is for management professors, which is basically how Blackbeard would teach an MBA class. And so Blackbeard was out to maximize the booty. How does he go? Very entertaining. Chris Coyne. Right? What his work is about is after-war reconstructions. When countries are torn apart, how do they try to put their pieces back together? What are the missteps that they make? What are that? He has a new book coming out, which is called Doing Bad by Doing Good, which is about the critique of humanitarian aid and efforts at doing that and how it generates perverse incentives and whatnot. In both of these cases, these guys are developing the intellectual tradition of mainline economics, in which economics is the most entertaining subject and economics is the most important subject. So when you're entertaining and important, you have to live economics. Okay, thank you.